Steelworks, Craig Herbertson. At night, after the massage session, Anne cycled back to her home in the hills. She always stopped for a few minutes on the metal bridge. The deep waters flowed beneath her, and it was time to smoke a cigarette. She felt easier in her body. The drifting swans bundled up asleep were scattered, like white blobs of clotted cream on the dark, placid surface. The ripple of water snakes and rats, and the gentle sway of the bridge, echoed to the rhythms of her pumping heart. Sure, she shouldn't smoke, but there was something easy about it. It felt just right. What with the hollow stars in the night sky and the light, chilled air on the lungs. The only thing that spoiled the effect was the vast steelworks on the west bank, still spewing out its vile smoke. The smoke itself was picturesque enough, tainted orange by the distant street lamps. In a way, it echoed her own attacks on an otherwise healthy body, her lungs, the mirrored equivalent of the beautiful river and its accompanying polluter. The colours and the flashing lights of the inner workings never really bothered Anne. It was the noise. After the massage, she liked to take the back way towards home, avoiding the city centre, to sweep down the cycle paths that skirted the big river. It was quiet, a time for those lonely thoughts and creative ideas that only come in silence. Then, when she hit the metal bridge, the noise began to intrude on her. The steelworks always sounded as if some giant leviathan was tearing its cage apart. The shudder of steel on steel, grotesque bangings and clatterings as bits fell off or were thrown aside by God knows what kind of machines. It was a horrific sound, the exclamation of a giant devil locked in a struggle with unnatural elements. Why people should insist that the works were a 24-hour affair baffled Anne. She had little idea about economics and cared less. The thing could be building cars or deconstructing empires for all she cared, as long as it did its stuff during the day. At the edge of the metal bridge, she leaned on the railing and took another drag on her cigarette. From the steelworks, a flurry of orange smoke spumed into the air. A burst of spray like a kid's firecracker followed. Anne observed the sparks hurtle skyward with the phlegmatic eye of a graphic designer. There was certainly something majestic about these awful construction grounds that sprawled for nearly a mile along the bank. Grim buildings and towers, metal shacks surrounded by barbed wire fences, and all absurdly lit by thief lamps. During the day, the factory had little to commend it aesthetically, but at night it provided a fantastic spectacle, fantastic with the exception of the smog and that grotesque noise. Occasionally she even heard it, a distant cacophony from her little apartment on the hill. Anne examined the burning embers of her cigarette. The strange thing was that even during the day you never saw any people there. Of course, the great wagons rolled in and out, but as a cyclist, or even come to think of it, on the rare occasions she had walked past on foot, she never recalled a driver. You would see the wagon roll in or out, and then it was off to somewhere utterly unknown, its driver a vague puppet shadow behind the wheel. You couldn't see inside the works unless you went up close to one of the 2 areas of fencing that exposed a flat plain, or, as she remembered on the south side, a series of gantries and a huge pile of steel slag. There was one other break in the fence where you could see the top of a mound of wrecked cars, fuel for the perpetually burning ovens. Anne recalled stopping at these various points some years ago, before she had discovered the alternative quiet route, but as far as she could remember, she had never seen a person in the factory. It was an odd thought. She tossed her spent cigarette on the bridge and carefully stubbed it out with her foot. The burning sparks drifted down towards the slow-moving river beneath her. The white swans remained huddled together, and the water snake had gone under the banks. There were only the deep currents of the river making abstract art with the reflections of orange-tinted smoke, and somewhere far away the chirp of a moorhen. Anne mounted her bicycle and idly pushed out over the bridge. Her tiny lamp sent a moth-wing flicker across the way, like a failing spotlight in the large theatre of evening. It was a lonely little light. She was about halfway across when she stopped and the dynamo ceased to power the battery. As always, after the massage, she felt a heightened state of perception. The yoga in the morning was a prelude, but the massage sessions, once-a-week affairs, really brought up her levels of awareness. She became suddenly aware of a desire to visit the factory. Not to look at it in the cold light of day, but to see it when it became truly alive, in the deep of night. It was a disturbing thought. She stopped at the far side of the bridge and leaned against the rails. The desire, when she analysed it, was linked with memories of her father. He had been dead now for over 2 years, but occasionally, at moments of crisis, she would dream of him. He'd usually be admonishing her for some willfully dangerous behaviour. Her habit of hitching lifts down south alone, not locking the apartment door, and of course her solitary bicycle rides through the night. The aftermath of these actions, now that she was alone, would precipitate a nightmare, but she always managed to control her emotional reaction. She was nothing if not independent. Now, however, she could picture his face, his pointing finger, and the inevitable, "Come on, girl, if you don't look after yourself, who will?" She smiled gently and turned her wheels around. "Sorry, Dad. Here we go again." The only response to her whisper was a sudden shriek from the distant steelworks. The factory buildings seemed to shimmer in the air, and a rocket-like flame burst into the heavens. October nights, Halloween, fireworks, sparklers burning the sky. Anne's father had loved Halloween and all its trimmings. Autumn had been his time, the time of falling leaves and cold winds with the log fire, and the little ceremonies of tea, biscuits, charades, and games of chance, just the two of them. It was strange how the massage sessions brought back all these deep memories. The memories were mostly happy. She had long since accepted his death. The wound wouldn't heal, but it was no longer a thrusting stab of pain. With a little shake she mounted the bicycle. The lamp hesitated and came on full as the dynamo sent its little hamster wheel voice out across the water. An owl swooped across the moon in a sudden, silent glide, and for a second Anne had a terrible vision of her old bedroom at night, the clawing fear of the shadow coat that hung on her door, the creaking as it opened to reveal the father coming to kiss her good night. She had cried then, but he was there. Why should she remember that now? The bicycle left the bridge and found the path that led along the factory road. Trees whipped by, caught in the tiny lamplight. The roar of the steelworks was muted by the wind in her ears and the rustling of the trees. Anne picked up speed. She didn't want to be too late home. Just one look, and then off. As she hit the long road, it suddenly occurred to Anne that her father had driven trucks at the steelwork when her mother was alive. It was so long ago. She must have been only 5 or so. He'd only worked there briefly, deliveries or something. Strange she should forget. The massage always did that, left her dreamy and prone to sudden flashes of insight. Perhaps it was the sight of the huge delivery wagons banked up on either side of the road, a peripheral vision seen through the trees. The first fence was visible on her right-hand side. Then she was alongside the wagons and the fence was obscured. As she passed each dark window, she went through the usual zombie scares. It was easy to imagine the doors lurching open and grim bodies falling out. But none did. She turned on the pavement, slowing down. The noise from the steelworks reached a threshold. The smog had made everything a little fuzzy except the pools of light embossing the heavens in amber and teasing reflections from the puddles. There was no one around. The wagons were all at rest. Through the bars of the first fence she saw the huge gantries and lifting machines, the massive pile drivers and bores, machines without end and without names. A little further along, half covered by the main building, a towering heap of slag merged with the dark clouds. It was an awesome sight. So strange to think her father had been there years ago, perhaps taking orders from big foreman, driving one of these trucks. God knows what he had done. He hadn't been very happy with it, whatever it was. Anne reached the first gate. There were a series of them in dwindling perspective, but from memory this was the main one. It was open, presumably for night deliveries, but there was no one around. She dismounted from the bicycle and took a few tentative steps towards the works checking hut. The hut was deserted. Slowly she pushed her bicycle into the yard. She was already forming an explanation. It would be hard to make oneself heard with the racket, but she was fairly sure a few shouted words about directions would save her face. Maybe she could just tell the truth, whatever that was. Her father used to work here, always wanted to have a little look, who would care? But really, there was no one around. Just ahead was a long brick wall carrying a placard with some union rules and regulations, and a visitor's sign hanging crookedly from a steep pole. She strode forward with a bit more confidence. Just visiting memories. It was then that Anne saw the bicycle stands. There were a number of them, just next to a small door dwarfed by a large, forbidding entrance. A huge clash of steel on steel clapped like thunder. She held her ears for a moment and hurriedly pushed her bicycle onto a stand. After a moment, the reverberation of the steel died down to a familiar, overpowering but almost bearable cacophony. With some curiosity, Anne looked across to the visitor's office. She could see an open door next to it and row upon row of men's overalls. Still no one around. When she turned back to take off her helmet, she was really struck by the number of bicycles. Hundreds of them, all neatly stacked against the wall, most with their owners' helmets hung on the frame. Some of them looked worth stealing, and strangely, she could see a padlock on any of them. The bicycles further away were older. Some of them even seemed rusty, but it was difficult to tell in the smog. She placed her helmet on the frame. She couldn't imagine it would be stolen. She could just see her father shaking his head. "It only takes a moment, Anne." But no one else had bothered. There must obviously be some workers around. They were hardly likely to steal a bike. A strange, almost bestial sound bellowed from the larger entrance. The grinding of steel on steel made Anne grit her teeth. It was like an enormous dentist drill gnawing on an open nerve. Still, she had come this far. She shook her hair and unzipped her coat. A light, brilliant in its intensity, played across the far wall of the revealed entrance. The anteroom was basically empty. A few cans and drums, a stack of working boots, and small tools on a series of pallets. And on the left-hand side, another smaller door. Still thinking of excuses, Anne advanced into the large entranceway. The noise here seemed suddenly subdued, contained, like the waters in a tank at a consistent level. Through the door, she could see a short corridor and another metal door, firmly shut by what looked like a ship's central locking handle. Anne walked down the corridor and peered for some time at the metal door and the large hand wheel. There was a metallic smell in the sweating air, tinged with a chemical odor of burning steel. For a full minute she stood, hearing the pulsing throb of some great engine and the huge drill-like sound of some unknown machine. What would her father say now? What would she say the moment some safety-helmeted worker popped through the door? A young woman looking for directions? It seemed a bit silly. Hundreds of men could come pouring out of the door on the way home. She had no idea of the shifts or hours they would be working, or what they were doing. She might even be arrested. Behind the door, the sound suddenly began to diminish. A strange half-silence filled with tones of dripping water and erratic clicks. It was now or never. She gripped the hand wheel and turned it. The door swung inwards easily. At first it was difficult to make anything out. Steam billowed outwards and twisted in curling wreaths. Anne peered forward, unwilling to cross the threshold. There was a sense of vast space, and the noise changed exponentially, as though her ears had popped with a drop in pressure. The chemical smell seemed intensified, but somehow changed. A vague, fishy odour, strangely musty, yet perverse with male pungency. She took a step into the chamber. She was next to a wall. On a rack at head height, rows of clothes, shirts, scarves, jackets, endless clothes, stretched until they disappeared into the mist. On the floor, boots and shoes lay in a neat row. The mists parted. The chamber was immense, with the proportions of an aircraft hangar. The metal roof soared above, obscured by gantries, steel ropes and huge metal beams that spread like the scaffolding of some manufactured parody of the Sistine Chapel. But Anne saw none of this. Her consciousness had been heightened as always by her massage, the tactile feel of hands on her naked body. Dreams had been awakened. She now remembered with a terrible intensity the real reason that had promoted her father to come into her room so many years before. She saw now that the clothes, the boots and shoes were as bizarrely organized as the rows of bicycles, and even as she stared with growing realization, she saw the children's shoes and girls' dresses strewn pathetically among the rest. Those near were new. As her eyes travelled the endless line, the garments took on the appearance of an old thrift shop, until they were nothing less than mouldering rags. They were all female clothes. An orchestra of huge metal instruments screamed as though tortured by a giant leviathan. Explosions like war cannonades battered Anne's mind and paralysed her thoughts, as sparks of raw, molten metal flew in burning sprays across the chamber. The shudder of steel on steel, grotesque matings of metal that rutted on metal. It was a horrific, inhuman sound, the exclamation of some giant, masculine monster locked in conflict unnatural desire. Slowly, mechanically, she began to strip